And welcome back, students. As we continue to delve into hardware, we're now going to talk about memory, but in a little bit more detail. So let's get started. So most RAM today is either dynamic RAM or static RAM, so DRAM or SRAM. Now DRAM is more popular due to cost effectiveness. It makes it popular to use in personal computers. SRAM is more expensive, but is typically much faster. And this is why it's often used mostly in networking gear such as switches. Now, synchronous dynamic RAM is what we're going to refer to and what we mean when we start discussing RAM in this lesson, because most RAM today is in the SDR RAM category. And we're going to start by looking at the double date or DDR RAM. So here's a quick DDR comparison. And you can see you have DDR, DDR2, DDR3, and DDR4 coming out in 2002, 2004, 2007, 2014. And down here you can see there is some changes of the technology as it has gone on. The physical size of the RAM hasn't really changed that much, but the slot and the number of pin connections have changed over the years. So for example, some of these changes, we start going through this. DDR RAM, this is deader than dinosaurs. All right, you're very unlikely to find this on a machine that is going to be running DDR. I mean, look at the year, it's 2002. The technology that used DDR, you're talking like Windows XP computers. This is very old, outdated technology. Then you have DDR2 RAM, which is obsolete but still used by some older desktops laptops that might use DDR2. Like some Windows XP computers would have some DDR2. You might get into some computers like Windows Vista that are using DDR2. However, most computers are going to be using DDR3, which is the current standard, which supports frequencies over twice as fast as DDR2 and higher capacities. Also, it's cheaper than DDR2 when you compare it at the same capacity. And part of that is because it's so widely used. I mean, if you look at these percentages down here, DDR2 and DDR3, like DDR2 had a 28% decrease in the number of voltage, a 50% increase in the speed, and a 100% increase in density. If we look at the DDR3, we have a 16% decrease in voltage, 166% increase in speed, and 300% increase in density. Look at this. This density is capping out here at 128. This one is doing 256. This density is 1 gig. So that's a pretty significant jump. And then we look at DDR4, we got 4 gigs. So those percentages play into the growth of the technology here. Now DDR4 RAM is the latest standard. Though buying machines with DDR4 can cost a pretty penny, frequencies start at DDR3's high end of 2133. Though capacities can go even higher, and due to being a new standard, DDR4 is better priced at the same frequencies and capacities than that of the DDR3 counterpart. So let's discuss capacity. This is simply how much storage is available in RAM. Right? Now you can have 512 to 1 gig of RAM. Now, unless you're running a machine from the 90s, early 2000s, this is not going to suffice. Like, you can't even run a computer with this much RAM. Now, you can still get 1 gigabit sticks to put in, because if you have 4 slots, you put 4 gigs in, you have a 4 gig machine. However, 2 gig is much more applicable. Remember, if you're running a 32-bit operating system, you'll either have 2 gigs or a 4 gig machine, most likely. Now, this can cause some very noticeable hitches in things like multitasking, especially when using multiple browser tabs, let alone multiple apps at once. As we mentioned, you can do some very basic multitasking, but you're not going to be able to do a lot. Now, 4 gigs is necessary for a 64-bit OS, and this is the maximum that you can use for a 32-bit OS. So it always is to your benefit just to always go and switch to 64-bit. Now, 4 gigs, if you recall, is good for general computer usage. You can do some multitasking, you can do some media playing, you can do some basic tasks. You might be able to do some light gaming. 8 gigs, that's though when you get into good for gaming and multitasking. You can do a little bit of photo and video rendering. 64 gigs, good for though virtual machines, the heavy visual rendering that you might be doing. You might be doing a lot of image editing. You have a lot of stuff going on. 16 gigs is really good for that. In fact, some games, 8 gigs is starting to get to the point where you may want to invest in 16 gigs simply because to fully take advantage of everything that the game has, because games are so graphically intensive now. Some of them are requiring like 6 gig requirements. And remember, you want 2 gigs for your OS. Well, if you're streaming too on top of that, for example, you might want the 16 gigs just so you have that extra memory. And then if we start going 32 to 64 gig or anything higher, this is servos. I can't even say servers, or crazy rendering of high quality video like 4K, for example. You're going to want a lot of crunching capacity because you're processing a lot of data. Doing things like 3D modeling because you have a lot of data that you're passing through. That's another thing that you could end up using this for. All right, continuing on with capacity. Now, memory is available in physical sticks that are placed in the motherboard's RAM slots. There's usually about 4 slots with 2 parallel ports. So pretty much they're usually color-coded, sometimes they're not. And what you'll do is you put 2 sticks in parallel. You can run them in a series, but running in series is not as strong as running in parallel. If you want a computer with 8 gigs of RAM, you should use 1 8 gig sticks, 2 4 gig sticks, or 4 2 gig sticks. Right, so those are your options. But which one is going to be the best option? Well, you never want to put just 1 stick in there. Because if you just put 1 stick in there, if that memory stick goes bad, you're done. I mean, yes, you can put in 1 stick, but I'd rather say, well, if I'm going to put 1 8 gig stick, I'm going to get a second 8 gig stick. Now I have 2 8 gigs, so I have 16. Hey, but if you really want to stick with the 8 gigs, 2 sticks are preferable to 4, as it's easier for your motherboard and CPU controller to handle only 2 sticks. It's less for it to have to process information and pass it through multiple channels. Now, 4 sticks can be a nightmare, though, when it comes to the compatibility. So let's say you're only able to, at first, budget-wise, get 2 sticks, and later on you can get 2 more. Well, if you have 2 sticks from one company and 2 sticks from another, or even if they are from the same company but they have like different frequencies and stuff like that, you could run into compatibility issues, and it's also going to limit your RAM frequency and timings when it comes to overclocking, because it's always going to go with like in terms of frequency, follow the small values. All right, now let's talk those terms that you have been bouncing around frequency a little bit here. So let's actually talk about what frequency is. Now, all RAM have a negative frequency. Frequency is measured in megahertz, and higher numbers potentially indicate faster access to the information stored in memory. The motherboard, though, will only accept certain frequencies of RAM. If you pick RAM that is faster than what your board supports, you'll be forced to run it at slower speeds. Now, on the other hand, if you pick speeds that are too slow, it's going to affect your system performance. So you want to always try and, within your budget, maximize that speed. And as a general rule of thumb, higher frequency means a higher performance. So a 2133 megahertz RAM stick will perform much faster than that of a 1800. All right. Continuing on frequency, DDR RAM unfortunately only supports 2 frequencies, 333 megahertz and 400 megahertz. Since DDR isn't supported anymore, we're not even going to worry about this. You don't even have to worry about writing that in your notes if you don't want to, because we're not really concerned about DDR. We are going to talk a little about DDR2 though, because obviously it still exists a little bit, even though it's obsolete. It's much more flexible and was the major step forward in volatile memory, and supports frequencies starting at 400 megahertz all the way up to 800 megahertz. So you can see it's a little bit higher frequency range. Now DDR3 is where we really start winning here, because at this point we started at 1066 megahertz and we're jumping all the way to 3200 megahertz. Right? Now, of course, as you start going to those higher frequencies, you start running to some more severe price hikes because it's more expensive because you're increasing the frequency range. Now, typically when people are building like their own machines, or you're looking at purchasing or anything like that, the sweet spot to kind of be around is 2133 megahertz. It's kind of like the sweet spot. You can go higher if you want to pay a little bit more money, but typically a lot of people for the DDR3 aim for the 2133. Now DDR4 RAM starts at 2133 megahertz, so it starts right there, that sweet spot, and it goes all the way up to a whopping 4,266 megahertz. So that's a very high number. Now megahertz is kind of almost becoming redundant at this point when we start talking about those really big numbers. So it's really almost a better way at that point to start saying, it's like, well, the peak frequency is 4 gigahertz. which is a lot higher than some commercial processors. You probably won't find too many machines running 4 gigahertz. I mean, yes, that's pretty blazing fast. And so you'll probably won't see a lot of machines approach that yet, because again, that's going to be extremely costly. And you're probably going to find something a little bit more in the mid-range, is usually about where people will meet. All right, next up, latency. The other big factor affecting speed is latency. Latency describes the delay between a request and the execution of the task, pretty much meaning that the lower the number is, the better. Usually a higher frequency, which makes RAM faster, can compensate though for higher latency. So if you have higher frequency, it might cancel out some of that higher latency. Remember, latency is going to make your RAM slower. As a general rule though, you're always going to prioritize your capacity, so how much your RAM stick actually is, over things like frequency and then your latency. So always look first at your capacity, because that's the first thing we covered. How big is your RAM stick? Then you're going to look at the frequency of that RAM stick, and then you look at latency last. Now, real quickly, let's just talk about latency and timings. RAM modules will typically have a series of numbers, so for example 9-10-9.227, which are referred to as timings. This is a measurement of the performance of the RAM in nanoseconds. The lower the number, the quicker the RAM can react to requests. The first number, 9, is what's known as the cast latency, or the number of clock cycles it takes for data to be requested by the memory controller for it to become available to a data pin. Generally, DDR4 is going to be higher in cast latency than DDR3, and DDR3 will be higher than DDR2. So actually, the newer RAMs are more prone to have higher latency, simply because of the speed and everything else that factors into it. There's a bunch of different things. We're just kind of really briefly touching over it, but just kind of know that. All right, one of the last things to talk about here before we start wrapping things up is voltage. Some RAM will require voltage that is above the regular standard. If this is the case, make sure your motherboard can supply that much voltage if required. Voltage increases are also commonplace with things like overclocking. So if you start overclocking your components, this is something that you may want to look into. Ultimately, most motherboards can support the RAM you include by increasing power needed, but make sure you double check before getting the largest RAM. Okay. All right, next up, memory identification. Identifying information about a RAM stick just by physically looking at the stick can be kind of hard to decipher. If you look here, you see this little label here, and you can see obviously the brand is Kingston. We have in here some information, but what does the information mean? Okay, assembled in China. Hey, what else does this mean? Well, for example, if we look at the stick, we can make out that there is 2 gigs and it uses 1.5 volts. So over here, you can see this 2G. That 2G refers to 2 gigs. This 1.8V refers to 1.8 volts. Now, if I were to look at the rest of the stick on here, the rest of this information, I could actually go to Kingston's website, which is what I would recommend you do for the rest of the information, and you could actually look up the information on that chip. And that concludes our notes, folks. Until next time.